text 25. We're on chapter 4, text 25. We kind of got to go through about half a dozen verses today, maybe even more. And they're not particularly intricate, but the verses assume that you have considerable familiarity with Hinduism, and specifically with Hindu practice, the various types of dharmas and karmas that existed some thousands of years ago in India. For instance, you could imagine if you were talking about, I don't know, we're in the West now in the year 2023, and I spoke a bunch of verses about Christmas as compared to Hanukkah, which is kind of actually a minor Jewish holiday, which doesn't go all the way back to, let's say, a Rosh Hashanah or a Yom Kippur, much bigger Jewish holidays. I compare that to a modern festival like Kwanzaa, which was a festival which was made up in the 60s as part of the Black Power movement and the offshoot of the Civil Rights movement, so that black people would have a holiday for themselves around this time. I don't know, I could compare that to some indigenous festivals, some indigenous winter festivals, or Saturnalia, or Yuletide, or different Nordic pagan festivals that existed. And I could just talk about all of that stuff. But if you weren't familiar with Western religion, with even recent history with things like Kwanzaa, with the Civil Rights movement, with Jewish holidays, with winter solstice type festivals that are celebrated around this time of year, it would just be, you could say, you'd almost have to write a book to give somebody enough familiarity with the West and the way we live in the West, and how, although these festivals may have originally had really substantial meaning because you're in the belly of the beast of winter, nowadays, especially in a place like Southern California, all that's left is the cheer of the season, as opposed to that you've made it through the darkest nights, you're on your way to recovery, or that you are, there is a possibility of dying, or that it's good to celebrate because we've gotten through the worst of it for the year, even if we're not afraid of dying. I remember Rome, they weren't afraid of dying. It doesn't get that cold in Rome. And that's why they had a big, big festive occasion, with feasting and such. So you could imagine if you just were from, I don't know, China, pre-Christian contact. And I just made reference to all these different things. You would stop me and you go, okay, what's Christmas? Okay, what happened in Christmas? Okay, what's this whole Saturnalia thing? Okay, what's the Yuletide? Okay, what's this thing with the tree? Sol Invictus? Who's Sol Invictus? How does this relate to Jesus? The Bible? The Torah? Hanukkah? How old's that? The high holidays? Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah, Kwanzaa? When? The Civil Rights Movement? Black Power? It would just be the commercialism. It would be one thing after another, and you would just get lost. There's a danger of that, because the following verses we're going to read assume that you have a working familiarity with Hinduism, and specifically Hindu spiritual practice. The kinds of things people did to achieve enlightenment in India thousands of years ago. The spiritual practices that were part of the topography and the landscape of ancient India. Now, because ancient India was a place in this world inhabited by human beings who were reaching out to God, then naturally there will be some corollaries or things that make sense that you can relate to your own experience, or even without any specific experience, you can relate them to general ideas of the soul reaching out to God, the soul striving for self-realization. So either you'll think of things from your own frame of reference, and you'll be able to compare this other culture and realize, oh, they're kind of like us. Oh, human beings are kind of similar, and we're all reaching out to divinity or for self-realization in similar ways, and the details may differ, but it's the same basic processes. Or let's say you had no frame of reference of your own rituals and your own practices, then you could say, I can understand philosophically why someone who is striving to reach out to divinity or striving to attain self-realization might do these types of things. But those two processes I say processes, but I think it might be processes grammatically. I think English might have gotten dumbed down. Hypotheses, processes. I want to say that's the formal way to say it, and then people have just gotten rid of it. Like no one says agendum as the singular for agenda, which is plural, or no one says datum as a singular for data, which is actually plural. So I think it might be like that. If you want to do the two things I just suggested you can do, what are the two things I just suggested you could do? What's one of them, Bailey? You can philosophically understand why it might make sense that people would do this thing because it accomplishes this end, even though I don't have any frame of reference to compare it to in my own life experientially, right? Okay, that's process number one, which was actually the last one I mentioned. And then the first one I mentioned, you can find corollaries in your own frame of reference, the things you grew up with. All of you will be able to do those two things. However, if you don't pay attention and recognize that we're talking about an exotic culture that you will not automatically necessarily know, you won't do those two things. You'll just get lost because the terminology and the foreignness of it will freak you out. You could imagine walking into a classroom, or you can imagine just walking into a lecture in a foreign language, maybe a language that you're only minimally familiar with, a language you have just a very passing understanding of, just a few phrases of the language. Maybe you took a 101 course in high school, something like that, where you would never be enough to learn the language. And you walked into a room and people were talking about something. And you would just have no idea what they were talking about at all. Alternatively, someone prepped you and said, hey, you won't understand the language, but it's a church gathering, and it's said in the Bible, and this is the Bible verse they're studying. And usually the teacher will quote the verse, and there'll be some back and forth discussion about each of the words in the verse. And then you walk into that same classroom with that frame with that, scaffolding, and you walked in there, you'd start to pick up little words and pieces, and in the cadence and the tonality of the speech, you'd start to pick up little bits and pieces of kind of what might be getting said. And you'll get something out of it, whereas otherwise you wouldn't understand a word. All of you have significant familiarity with Hinduism, but not all the stuff we're going to talk about now. Not all the stuff we're going to talk about now. So because you're not familiar with all the stuff we're going to talk about now, I want to give this as a introduction to get everybody in the right mood so we can all listen and understand. And then I'm going to give you some sentences and paragraphs for each verse we read, explaining what it is specifically that's being talked about. But you got to listen to those sentences carefully, because they're going to give you a hack to where you'll be brought in at a high level to the spiritual landscape in terms of practice of ancient India. And then with that, you'll then be able to compare it to things or abstractly understand it. Now this is following up on that Brahmarpanam verse. Brahmarpanam, Brahmahavi, Brahmagna, Brahmanahutam, that verse we just read. Brahmatena Gantavyam, Brahmaiva Tena Gantavyam, Brahmakarma Samadhina. That verse. And so we spent a couple of weeks on that verse, and then following in the footsteps of that verse, where the old Vedic sacrifice was repurposed and reimagined, and all of its constituent elements were related to Brahman, to give you an idea about how everything can be spiritualized in your life. And we're now following in the wake of that statement. Daivim evapade yagyam yogina paryupasate. Some yogis worship by sacrifice to the gods. This is Daivim Yagyam. So they're worshiping, some apade are worshiping paryupasate by sacrifice, yagyam, to the gods, diving. Who are those people? Yogina. They're yogis. And they're worshiping or sacrificing by offering sacrifice to the gods. What does that mean? That means that there were people in polytheistic Hinduism who worshipped many gods, similar to how Greeks or Romans or pagans and the Norse pagans, I don't know where they were, Norway, I guess. Scandinavia, I think, is probably more accurate. There's a few countries in there. Was it Norway, Denmark, and Sweden? The Scandinavian countries. Also Germany was largely pagan, or all pagan, and you had the people who were in England before the arrival of the Britons, and so, the Britons that were in England before the arrival of the Romans. And so you've got all these pagan peoples. I'm not familiar with all of them, but you've got the Saxons, and you've got the Germanic hordes, and the Gauls, and the Vikings, and there's just a whole bunch of them. I never studied that. I mean, I know enough that I know more than, if you don't know what I just said, then I know more than you, but I haven't elaborately studied it. So we know about polytheism, at least in passing. And so it's referring to that some spiritually minded people were properly situated in doing something which was selfless, which qualified as yajna, which qualified as sacrifice, but they weren't Vaishnavas per se. They weren't our massive sect of 400 million Hindus. They were rather these polytheists. They existed, but they were not heterodox. They were not apostates. They were not rejected. They weren't, I'm sorry. How many of you knew what the word heterodox meant? Okay, how many of you know what the word apostate means? All right, so we're not doing too great, so that's okay. That's all right. I'll just dial it in. Heathens, infidels, goyim. They weren't outside of the fold. In a inclusivistic society like Hinduism, you don't have this hard exclusivism that you find in the West, where there's heaven and hell and you're either in or you're out. That's very much of a Middle Eastern phenomenon. The further east you go, the more you get these great civilizations, China and India, where people were able to get along and live together and have different belief systems. And they would cross-pollinate and infuse and feed each other, and they got along relatively well. And you would be included in the family of spiritually minded people, in the family of people who were doing something selfless and doing something good, even if you weren't part of somebody's sect. So although the Gita is about devotion towards Krishna and devotion towards a supreme deity and the source of all existence, nonetheless, within the family of people, maybe not people who fully understand the Gita, but the family of people who at least understand the principle of yajna, the principle of giving something back, the principle of reciprocity, the principle of charity, the principle of offering something back to God to say thanks for what you've been given, which exists almost, let's say, only in the West nowadays in the form of ritual. But what ritual do we have in the West? Tithing. Okay, so charity. And there's one other one where we try to give something back. It's more theoretical. It's less, it's just very, very simple. And you would have all had experience of it growing up. Yeah, sure, there's singular days like Thanksgiving. Well, Thanksgiving is totally secular. But think about it. But what is it that you used to do with your family when you ate? I gave it away now. You'd say a prayer. You'd say grace. And you'd thank God for this food. And there was an idea that you were giving thanks and giving back in the form of gratitude to appreciate what had been given to you. So that sentiment of giving something back and having it be spiritual, not just the way a secular humanist would give back by, somebody helped me when I was a kid, so I help others, but in a way that I'm giving back to what? To God, some higher power. You got it. Okay, good. So some offer sacrifice, some yogis worship by offering sacrifice to the gods. Now, is offering sacrifice to the gods what Krishna wants to teach? No. Does he criticize it? Yes. Does he say it's a terrible thing? Yes. Does he say those people don't go back to Godhead? Yes, he does. Does he say those people's intelligence has been stolen? Yes. Does he say those people are lusty? Yes. Does he say those people don't achieve self-realization? He does. But at least they're doing something to uplift themselves on some level, and they're showing some thanks. And so earlier on in the Gita, these people are given a little bit more appreciation, acknowledgement. And as the Gita goes on and Krishna refines his teaching, they don't always make the cut. It's like, an episode of Survivor, which I never watched, but where you might not make it all the way to the end, but at least you manage to get past the first couple of cuts. They don't get rid of you right away. You make it to the third or fourth show or something like that. You're a finalist or something like that. You might not have won, but at least you got second place. You follow? So these people are at least in the family. Brahmagna apade yagyam yagyena yagyenaiva upajuvati. So upajuvati, they worship yagyena by yagya. They worship by the yagya of yagya into the fire of Brahman. They worship by the yagya of yagya, by the sacrifice of sacrifice into the fire of Brahman. What does that mean? Yeah.
It's like somewhat of a reference to the last verse, doing the same in the fire of sacrifice.
That's right. This is referring to the Vedic priests who performed sacrifice yagya, built a fire in a fire pit, offer ghee and grains. They do yagya by doing yagya. The other ones are doing yagya to the gods, by offering things to the gods. These ones are doing yagya by doing yagya, and they're offering something instead of into the fire of this or into the fire of that, they're literally offering it into the fire of the fire when they're doing the yagya. Other ones will be said they're offering it into the fire of their breath, into the fire of their consciousness, into the fire of this, into the fire of that, into the fire of hearing, into the fire of sound. But this one is they're offering it into the fire, and they literally mean the fire. They got a ladle and they're pouring ghee and grains into the fire. You get it? So you have two kinds of spiritualists. You have the polytheistic worshipers who do some ritual, and then you have the full ritual guys who are all about the ritual, who incant Vedic mantras, and they light the fire and they perform the sacrifice. And that sacrifice, although it is connected to a deity, and so if it's not completely dissimilar to the worship of many gods, they're really into that ritual. Perfect intonation, gathering all the ingredients, and doing everything in a very scientific, perfect precision way. And somehow that's the way they connect with something higher, is by perfectly performing a ritual. Is there any corollary to that in the West? Yeah.
Orthodox Jews who are really, really strict in their rituals.
Yeah. That's not a bad one. I hadn't thought of that, but it's not terrible. When you talk about Reform Jews, they don't really care if you believe in God or not. It's very much about ethnicity and learning the Hebrew language. When you talk to conservative and especially Orthodox Jews, that changes. They're way more into the rituals, way more into them, way more into the Hebrew, way more into the rabbinic commentaries, way more into the 613 mitzvahs, way more into Leviticus and Deuteronomy. They're really into it. But they also, what? Fully believe in God. Fully believe in God. Have a very robust devotional life. In that sense, they might not perfectly fit it because there's too much devotionalism. Does that make sense? And then it could be, Catholics also get a little ritualistic at times, but then you would always understand they were also devotional. Anglicans would be the Protestant version of Catholicism, or the Lutheran Church for that matter, or the Moravian Church, which is out of Czech, also an early Reform movement. So it wasn't a bad guess. Can you guys think of any culture they get so into the ritual that's kind of all there is? and they lose that devotionalism to some extent. I can't. It's something which is really, it's very, very Hindu. Now, if I didn't want to be argumentative with you and I just want to go along with what you're saying, I'd say, yes, these people might have a belief in a higher power, in a deity, but the way they show their devotion is by doing that ritual and doing it perfectly. In which case, any super heavy ritual Orthodox person in any church where they really get into the Gregorian chants, they really get into learning the original language, they really get into the recitation, let's say, of sacred scriptures and things like that, they really get into doing the rituals and lighting incense just perfectly and doing the liturgical procedures perfectly on the altar with the proper vestments on, and the paraments in the proper color and the proper season. In any of the old world traditions, you find really heavy ritual. And then you'll find some priests who are just all about the ritual. But I mean, to give an example, I know a devotee who does yajna, and he got the ladles, there's two ladles, Shruva and Shruk, the two ladles, and he got them tattooed on his forearm. That's how into the ritual he is. He got a tattoo, and he got a tattoo of the ladles, of the wooden spoons that are used to offer yajna. It becomes a thing. If you listen to Hindu Yajnik Brahmanas chant Vedic mantras, they were never written down. They were passed on from father to son. And we're going back now hundreds of generations because they're chanting Vedic mantras the way they were chanted thousands of years ago. And the only way we know how the Vedic mantras were chanted thousands of years ago is because when you listen to them chant and then you go back and you read stuff, you understand what it's trying to say. It's a living tradition that was never written down, that's just been passed on from father to son, and it's incredible how precise they are. Gregorian chants are something. You know, Muslims get into this sometimes when they write the verse of the Quran in Arabic, and you know, it's getting this really beautiful calligraphy and put that all over the Kaaba and Makkah, and you get this where people get really attached to their sacred language. But that's only part of it. There's also the ritual, precisely how the ritual is performed. And everything has to be done at the exact right time. You have to hold each syllable when you chant for the exact right amount of time. The yajna has to last a certain amount of time. It has to be, you have to make the fire pit an exact, it has to, you know, almost like a Fibonacci sequence type thing where it has to be exactly, perfectly made, facing in the exact right direction. You have to sit in the right direction. They have to have X amount of priests. They also have to be able to chant in unison. If anybody makes a mistake while they chant, there has to be another priest who sits there and he corrects the mistake. So he's listening to them chant, and if they mess up, almost like what you would get on TV when they do that little a 7-second delay. So in case you swear on TV, they can edit it out. There's a Brahmin who sits there and listens to everyone chant, and if anyone makes a mistake, he corrects it. That way there was no mistake which was made. Are you guys getting a feel for what I'm talking about? And so when you get a feel for what I'm talking about, I can't think of any corollary. It's almost alchemical in its precision. There's a scientific alchemical aspect to it, where religion merges with alchemy. Maybe that's the closest you get, is an alchemy. And the pursuit of the Holy Grail, or the pursuit of the universal solvent, or you get the pursuit of the touchstone, or the pursuit of the fountain of youth. And you know, and it's science. It's science. It's a primitive science, engineering, and religion. Back in the day before we separated them into two divisions, and they were one. You get that like with the Greeks, where they were mathematicians and they were philosophers, and it was you were doing both. You were looking for truth. A Leonardo da Vinci type personality in a more of a modern time. A Pythagoras going back, Aristotle going back further. Aristotle going back, and Pythagoras even before him, or in the more modern time, a Leonardo da Vinci. Almost like a Tesla type figure, where but at least the myth around Tesla, that he was Nikola Tesla, that he was almost religiously devoted to experimenting. At least the way he gets played out when they do homages to him in modern day movies, he seems almost like a devotee of electricity and the laws of physics. And so it would be some kind of combination of a physicist and a theologian and a mathematician, and it was all centered around the Vedic rites. Sometimes you'll get statements where, if there is a God, then he's duty-bound to give you success if you do the right properly. So don't worry about whether there's a God or not, because if he exists, he's also bound by the right as much as you are, the sacred right as much as you are. You get those kind of statements from people in this camp, where they're utterly devoted to, and the deity for them becomes the ritual. We would say you're missing the forest for the trees. You get so hyper-focused on something, you're not seeing the larger picture. We would offer that critique. And as I'm speaking more, I'm seeing you guys get more and more lost, correct? No?
Kind of like the Masons, right?
Well, yeah, right, because we're into alchemy, right? So the Masons, now that gets into, or the Rosicrucians, or all these different.
What about like witchcraft?
Sure, witchcraft and the occult, right? Where there are higher powers there, but they're bound by those same rites. And if you do those rites, then they have to follow it. So now we're in pagan stuff, voodoo, shamanism, witchcraft, hermetic rites, hermetic groups, alchemy, liturgical procedures. It is there. It's there. It's there in old world cultures. But the bizarre thing within Hinduism is, for these Yajnik guys, they were kind of all of that wrapped up in one. They had the perfect pronunciation. They built the perfect yajnas. They had all the right ingredients. They knew all the recipes. They did everything perfectly with scientific precision. How long each syllable was stressed. Their entire language was modified into contractions, like do not becomes don't. So the entire language was modified with contractions so it could just roll off your tongue. Like we have the Srimad Bhagavad Gita, right? But it's actually not the Srimad Bhagavad Gita. It's the Srimat Bhagavat Gita. But a hard syllable like a ta and a soft syllable like a ba or a ga don't work in Sanskrit. So Srimat Bhagavat Gita gets shortened. Srimad Bhagavad Gita. See how it flows? So the entire language was done like that, so the Vedic mantras could just flow. They mastered circular breathing as well. And so, or if they were going to take breaths in between the Vedic mantras, those were timed and choreographed. You find little homages to this when you get into vinyas, a serious vinyas practice, where you're told which breaths to do as you're moving into and out of an asana. And not only do you choreograph the asana with its influenced by Swedish gymnastics, sub-asana elements, where if you're going into handstand, then they choreograph how you get into your handstand. If you're going to a headstand, how you get into your headstand. And they choreograph the interim moves in between two asanas so that it perfectly flows from one to another. And then the next level is you choreograph the breath within the asana. That is this type of devotion applied to yoga. It's built on this idea that you learn to focus on something and see nothing else. the famous story in this regard that's included in the Srimad Bhagavatam. Again, another contraction. Srimad Bhagavatam. Srimad Bhagavatam is that there was an arrow maker. And we should learn from the arrow maker. And what's the lesson from the arrow maker? The lesson is that there was a parade, and the king came with his entourage and his retinue, and amidst so much pomp and circumstance. And afterwards, the whole village was talking about what an amazing occurrence it was, and the dancers and the musicians, and the king was being carried on a dolly, on a palanquin. It was being carried, and all the soldiers that were there, and the singers that were there, and they were all talking about what an amazing experience it was. And they asked the arrow maker, who was making an arrow, they said, "What did you think of the parade?" And he goes, "What parade?" Because an arrow maker has to make that arrow so straight that he has to focus on it with absolute devotion. And everything else gets drowned out. Some people got that way about their liturgies. And yeah, I think we came up with some good corollaries. Of course, how many of you have studied shamanism or the voodoo tradition or the alchemical traditions of the world? And so these things we might have little imaginings or little vignettes or little tiny tidbits of them that float around our consciousness, most likely that we've gotten from watching movies where these things were touched on. But there's a whole science, which is alive and well today, that you can study. You can find pundits who do yoga. I mean, when you watch a well-trained Brahmin do a yajna, it's a thing of beauty. It's just like Anandani got initiated on the fly. Radha Maharaj was on his way to the airport. I got to stop off at a Hanuman temple, 2 minutes from the airport. And then we drove in from Vrindavan, and Maharaj met us at this Hanuman temple, which also happened to have a Radha Krishna deity. And Maharaj gave her second initiation so she could go on the altar here. It was a very, very special experience for all of us. But it just so happened that they had a Sri Vaishnava Brahmana who had been shipped up from south, a Vaishnava Brahmana who was living in the compound for a year and would do a Sudarshan Yajna every single day, a full 3.5 hour Sudarshan Yajna every single day. Full Vaishnava Yajna. And we got there, and she got her initiated, and it just so happened that the yajna was going on right as she got initiated, and we sat in on the yajna. And it was 20 minutes, and it was finished. It was like, could not have been perfect timing. But you were watching that Brahmana, and he was just in front of this massive fire pit that he built every day from scratch. And they put cow dung on it. It's a whole act of devotion. And Rangoli all over the whole thing. And he sits, and he doesn't move for hours. And he surrounds himself with hundreds of containers and offerings. And so he just sits there and he's just moving. And it's like, and he's not stopping. And mantras being chanted, and acharans being done, and auspicious things being thrown this way and that way, and picking this up and offering, putting it down here. And then the next thing's being offered, and then rinsing his hands off, and then doing some mudras. And it's like, it's the whole thing is just without ever breaking, without ever losing focus on what he's doing. He doesn't even look at you. Or if he does look at you, he reaches over to grab something here, looks at you, and then goes back to what he's doing. But he never breaks form. The level of expertise is the kind of thing you spend 10 years doing it every day to do it like that. It's like watching a ballerina perform. But he's sitting there offering things and chanting mantras while he offers them. And that's his method of connecting with divinity. All right. That was my attempt to get you guys so you could appreciate. And this was a form of spiritual practice that was there on the spiritual landscape of ancient India, and it's being referenced here as another way that people connect to something higher than themselves. You got it? All right. Some yogis perfectly worship the demigods by offering different sacrifices to them, and some offer sacrifices in the fire of the Supreme Brahman. And the literal is some offer sacrifice by sacrificing into the fire of Brahman. All right. Srotra adhini indriyani anye samyam agnishu juvati. All right. So now we have anye juvati. Others, they worship. How do they worship? They worship samyama agnishu. You guys know the word samyama? Kumi, you know the word samyama?
Altogether.
That's true. But what does it mean?
Practice together.
But what does it mean?
Total.
When, according to the Yoga Sutras, when you're able to do dharana, dhyana, and samadhi, all three of the higher elements of the ashta angas, the 8 limbs, those 3 things put together, dharana, holding your mind, dhyana, meditating, and samadhi, a perfectly equipoised mind, when you're able to offer all 3 of those things together, put them all together in your practice, that's called samyama, or complete control. So now it's samyama agnishu, in the fire of complete self-control. Anye juvati, others worship. Strotra adini indriyani, by offering the senses beginning with hearing. This is taken by the traditional commentators to mean some people, like the celibate monks, who live their life hearing from a guru and studying under a guru, and thereby engage all of their senses in the pursuit of spiritual practice, and they give up anything in the material world. And so they offer themselves through their senses into the fire of full self-restraint. And the verse is a poetic way of referring to celibate monks, ascetics, who live a life of spiritual practice where that's all they do. You follow this? Now, to appreciate that, you have to appreciate ascetic culture. We have that. Of course, it usually gets a bad name, like in Catholicism, where you have to take a vow of celibacy in order to be ordained as a priest. You can become a deacon. There's 3 levels of ordination: deacon, bishop, and deacon, bishop, cardinal. Is that it? Deacon, priest, bishop. Thank you. Deacon, priest, bishop. That's correct. Cardinal's a type of bishop. It's not a separate thing. It's a type of bishop. Deacon, priest, bishop. So if you can be a deacon and be married, but to be a priest or a bishop, for those 2, then you have to be celibate for life. You have to take a lifelong vow of celibacy. So in the Vedic tradition, brahmacharis, up until the age of 25, were celibate. From birth till 5, they lived with their parents, and they went to the guru's house. They lived with the guru and studied under him from the age of 5 to 25. The guru and his wife adopted them and raised the children, and they were taught for 20 years. And then when they turned 25, they were either given the opportunity to live forever in the guru's ashram, or at that time what was traditionally done is you would get married. You would take a ritual bath, you would complete your education, and you would go and get married, and then you'd learn those. You spend some of your time in student life. But student life also involved celibacy. And we do this. We have people go to college, and they go to preschool and grade school and junior high and high school and college up until their mid-20s. We just don't attach the celibacy thing to it. I was just reading an article, and kids these days are, on average, they are watching pornography by the time they're 12. Which might sound horrific and terrible and awful for their growth, but when I read the article, it was like, don't be surprised. And I was thinking, what is surprising about that? I mean, I'm assuming every 12-year-old. I had these talks with my kids about this stuff when they're 8. I don't wait until they're 12 or 10 or 13. And the article is trying to say you got to be more proactive and this and that. I'm thinking 12 is just way late to the party. So we don't do the celibacy thing. We have, kids just go and explore, do their thing, and just whatever they're going to do, and don't think too much about it. But we do have that idea that you should get an education when you're young. So there was education and celibacy and a period of your life where you were very, very austere. The Mormons try to do this. They send their kids on missions for a couple of years. So they try to do this. Old world cultures did this. They kept everybody from having sex. They sequestered the sexes, and it was a big deal. There's that, the Jewish thing. I don't know how often it was done. I think it is actually a thing in Hasidic culture still, and I think it's probably was a thing in Orthodox culture, where when you would deflower a girl when you would consummate your marriage, and her hymen would break, you would then take the bloody sheet and hang it out your window to symbolize the whole community that her virginity was intact. I'm imagining that, many times there was a problem, and so you probably just got a razor blade and the guy cut his finger or something like that and did something, just just the gypsies used to do that too. Gypsy culture used to do that also. Romany culture. Sorry, can't call it gypsy culture anymore, because that people thought they were from Egypt. It's just a super misnomer. That's where the word gypsy came from. People thought they were from Egypt. The Romany people actually come from India. And you can look at their DNA. They're out of India, Rajasthan specifically. You get this very old world thing, but it was some people wanted to give their whole life to being a devotee. And we have this in the Hare Krishna movement. You have brahmacharis, where they've been a priest, they've been celibate for 50 years. They never married, and they live in an ashram, and they just, they do the morning program and study and go out and distribute books and don't ever get married and live really simply and sleep on the floor and take cold bath, and just from the time they were young up until they're old men, they live like that. Sometimes they won't even take sannyas, because if you take sannyas, you start to become guru, and then people start to serve you. So sometimes Prabhupada would meet his godbrothers who were in their 80s at that point, but they were still brahmacharis, and Prabhupada would comment on it and say they never took sannyas because they just wanted to always be serving. And so you'd see them as old men still cleaning the floor and serving food and just living a life of menial service. And there's something beautiful about it. To really appreciate, you have to have done it. And so for most people who joined the Hare Krishna movement, from my generation, we became brahmacharis, and we lived. I was a brahmachari for 9.5 years. And so we lived as celibate monks for a number of years, and then afterwards we got married. And it's a beautiful time. Anandani has this experience. Shri has a version of this experience. She's also making $1 million a year, so it is what it is. But there's at least the idea of the celibacy and doing service all day. She's got that down pat. You had it for a minute. You had a little bit of that before Ross came and swept you up. And so, a little bit in your life? You were in Gurukul. You lived in a Gurukul in Vrindavan. You had something like this at some point. You got initiated, so I'm assuming you were really enthusiastic and doing a lot of service at the temple, going to the temple with all your free time. You would have had this a little bit with the way you grew up with your family. You've got a little bit of this. Even though you're not living in an ashram per se, or you never have, you do come and see us 3-4 times a week, and this is kind of your life. And so you're getting this a little bit, it's a thing. And so usually we do it just for a little bit, so we can kind of appreciate the verse. And then some people do it for a whole lifetime, and they can really appreciate the verse. But now for some people, the sacrifice, the fire, is the sacrifice of self-restraint, where they offer all of their senses and they no longer indulge and enjoy. You follow this? Okay. Then we have Shabdadin Vishayan Anya Indriya Agni Shu Juvati. Now Anya, others, Juvati, they offer Indriya Agni Shu. They offer into the fire of their senses. They offer Shabda Adin Vishayan. They offer objects such as sounds, tastes, smells, touches, sights. They offer objects that are processed through their senses into the fire of the senses. What's this poetically referring to? That's right, married people. They're not offering their senses, instead of engaging with the objects of the senses, they're just being offered into self-restraint in an ashram or a temple. These people are going out and enjoying with their senses, but then offering those objects they enjoy after the fact, the same way a married person would give tithe, give money, and think of their family as being, part of their service. And so now instead of fire of self-control, it's into the fire of the senses, and they're offering vishai, which means objects that you enjoy, into that fire, but there's some regulation. And so now it's being